Hi everyone, this is going to be a quick recap of how person and environment over time dimensions are impacted during infancy and toddlerhood. Some of the stuff we may have covered in other lectures, but I just kind of want to get your brains thinking about how different dimensions are impacted, specifically during this stage. So if we start with the person dimensions, we have biological, psychological, and spiritual, obviously. I'm not necessarily going to cover all of these in full because that would make a very long video, and I'm trying not to make these super long. But I just want to kind of highlight biological impact. We've talked about that in the previous videos with the risk factors, and it's also mentioned in the narrative section on the online modules. But so much physical development takes place during this stage. We've talked about how different environment can impact the biological. I think one of the big things that we didn't talk about, but a topic that often comes up, is breastfeeding versus bottle feeding. Is one better than the other? There's a lot of mom shamers out there if you don't breastfeed your child. There's a cost component connected to it. There's impact on caregivers if you breastfeed because the mom is the primary source of feeding, having to get up in the middle of the night to breastfeed. Bottle feeding allows other family members to participate. So does that play a positive impact on maternal health? Does it take away bonding if you don't breastfeed? So that kind of actually ties into the psychological component. But as far as the biological for the infant or toddler, it is something to consider. Premature birth and NICU stay is another biological piece that we didn't talk at large about, but there can be a lot of implications when your child is born early and spends time in NICU as far as brain development, physical development, attachment to the mother. Those pieces come into play. Thankfully, Grand Rapids is super lucky to have Helen DeVos Children's Hospital in the area. So if you do, if an individual has a premature baby, there is a hospital right here. Both of my two children, Quinn and Ivy, my 3-year-old and my 5-month-old, both have had engagement at Helen DeVos. Quinn was born with a cleft lip, and so she's had a lot of surgeries there and receives care from there. And Ivy was a NICU baby because she was born early. So I'm very thankful that they received very good care there. The psychological dimension, we talked a lot about the attachment and the separation anxiety that children in this stage can experience, what good attachment is, what negative attachment is. That all is involved in the psychological development. Spiritual, they don't cognitively understand spirituality during this stage. Their brains just are not there. The biggest piece, I think, with the spiritual is that trust versus mistrust and the belief that their caregivers are going to get their basic needs met, creating that sense of security and attachment. There is a spiritual component there, and that kind of builds once you get into the spiritual theories of development, which we'll get to in different stages because there's not much during this. I think the biggest spiritual piece maybe to take into consideration is how is the caregiver's spirituality impacting this stage. There are some spiritual and religious beliefs that involve alternative medicine or alternative approaches to parenting or to taking care of a child, and does that have any impact on the child's behavior or development? These are good questions to ask if you're doing an assessment on a client who is pregnant and kind of exploring how their spirituality will impact the child, not necessarily the child's spirituality. We move on to the environmental dimensions. Physical environment, we talked about overcrowding, how having very limited physical space can inhibit child's development because there's just no space to play. And play is a huge piece of development during this stage. Is there appropriate space for sleep? There's a big debate about co-sleeping, like having the child sleep with you versus having a child sleep in the crib. Education on safe infant sleeping, and so on the back is best. That is the best practice that's out there from a medical standpoint. Having a child on its back with no blankets. Is there space in the environment for that to occur? We also talked about how limited access to proper nutrition, fresh food, can impact development, and not having grocery stores or that available in close proximity to the home as part of the physical environment can really impact child's physical development. Culture obviously has a huge impact on how you raise a child. And so how parents decide to raise their child, so parenting styles, if the parents, both parents work or one parent works, if they believe that the culture of having the mother take the primary caregiving role and the dad is more hands off, or is the culture to have split parenting decisions, it'll impact how a child is attaching with parents, how they are supported and nurtured both with social development and also encouraging that physical development as well. We talked at length about poverty's impact in the risk factors video. So the prenatal care, diet, parental education, and supports that they have to kind of reduce, first of all, infant mortality rate. So infant mortality is when the infant dies before their first birthday, but also just to influence positive development right from the bat. Social structures and institutions, so kind of that big umbrella institutions. We talked about the maternity. I didn't mention paternity leave, but that's a thing too. Having the father being able to take time off is huge too, just for bonding and for support for the mom. So talking about how different the United States' maternity and paternity leave policies are compared to the rest of developed countries, and what role social workers have in advocating for changes. And I think another huge one is that government assistance program. So having WIC, TANF, which is food stamps, and Medicaid available for children who do not have, whose parents do not have insurance. Mothers can also be eligible for Medicaid while they are pregnant. So to make sure that they're receiving proper care as well prior to the baby being born. Formal organizations. So we see a lot of organizations that children are involved in are the daycare centers. For those who are having parents who work. Child Protective Services is another organization that can come into play, whether the child is being taken immediately after birth or if there is neglect or abuse during the early years. Sometimes that can be hard to note because children aren't necessarily engaged in any outside services that might pick up on any abuse or neglect. So hospital social workers keep an eye out for it, daycare centers as well. But they're not in a formal school where teachers are mandated reporters. So they obviously are involved at this situation, but there's not as many eyes on often during this stage. Foster care children are involved in this formal organization. Orphanages, we didn't really talk much about this when we were talking about trauma and neglect as a risk factor, but there is a lot of research about orphans who are in Romanian orphanages and just the lack of stimulation and individualized attention that they got from caregivers there, kind of the negative effects it had on development. And so is how orphanages are run. Are they the best evidence-based practice of how they run services? What kind of effect does that have on attachment long-term? And then there's various other social service agencies providing Healthy Start, kind of the education around what parents can expect in the first years. Social movements that are involved at this stage. Vaccinations is a big one. Well, not even talking about COVID vaccinations, but prior to that is vaccinating your child, something that is appropriate and necessary. Some people say yes, some people say no, and some people will be strong advocates for either party. Breastfeeding, we mentioned in the biological. I think another great one that I didn't add into the child and infant lecture just for the sake of time is trauma-informed care and a thing what is called the ACE study. So that's adverse childhood events. And researchers are looking at these different adverse events that happen during childhood and the impact they have long-term on functioning, especially physical health. And they have found that children who scored higher on these ACEs, which could be like abuse in the home, a parent getting divorced, different types of trauma during these formative stages, how impactful that is on their physical health and well-being at the as they get into adulthood. It's really, really interesting, and it's becoming kind of a best practice to implement some of these informed care techniques into both medical care, behavioral health care, It's kind of a big hot topic right now, but it's also very, very impactful and important for teachers and social workers and doctors and different types of service providers to be aware of. Communities that children are involved in could be activity centers, play groups. Moms or parents might be involved in mom groups, exercise groups. I know there's like mom to mom ones that they go exercise together and push their babies and then have a craft. And so not only is a community good for the child, but it's good for the caregivers as well to kind of decrease some isolation and possible depression. Small groups, you might go to nursery at church. I don't know how many churches have an active nursery right now because of COVID, but it is one place to start for socialization. And postpartum support groups for mothers, breastfeeding groups for mothers, a lot of small groups will be provided for the caregivers, not necessarily the infant or toddler. Families, we talked about inadequate caregiving as a risk factor, substance abuse as a risk factor. Having good support, like strong support or no support, can make a difference in the health of the caregivers. Culture and how families take care of each other is another thing to consider. And so it could be family size. Is it mom staying home? Do the grandparents stay home? Often you'll hear about grandparents raising children based on the health of the mother. They might default to having the grandmother take care of them as part of the foster care system, or a change in guardianship to help the mother or the caregiver become more healthy. Dyads, I think a huge one to take into consideration, and a lot of services focus on the mother and child relationship. So I mentioned before, the depression and the postpartum and even mental illness as a whole can really impact a mother's ability to take care of the child, and that can then impact ability to attach, and then that can impact relationships further down the road. So I think a lot of services target that. I don't think not as many services target the father-child relationship, but I would love to see that continue because that's a huge piece, as a huge relationship and a dyad to take into consideration, not only between the mother and the father, but also the child and the father, and having another area of strong attachment to develop. I'm not going to go over time dimensions just because we're kind of talking about time in regards to the life stage, kind of that linear time piece. So it's probably more, the more nuances come into the environment and the person in dimensions. But as you can see, like there's just a lot of things to consider and kind of look at when we're thinking about the dimensions and this group.